Ed Sullivan was a very popular TV host in America. He had a show called The Ed Sullivan Show that many people liked. He was good at finding new stars and helping them become famous. Even though many people watched his show and knew him around the world, Sullivan had some secrets. He didn't always get along with some of the famous people who came on his show. In this video, you will find out more about Ed Sullivan's life and learn about the interesting things that happened behind the scenes of his show. Sullivan was born in New York City on September 28, 1901. His parents were Elizabeth and Peter Sullivan. He had a twin brother named Daniel, but sadly Daniel died when he was just a baby. Sullivan grew up in Portchester, New York, in a small red brick house on Washington Street. His family was Irish, and they loved music. They often played the piano, sang, and listened to records. Sullivan was good at sports in high school. He played football, basketball, and ran track. He also played baseball and was the team's captain. He remembered that in New York, it was normal for different races to play sports together. He didn't believe in treating people differently because of their race. After finishing high school, Sullivan started working at a local newspaper called the Portchester Daily Item. He had been writing sports news there while in school. He began working there full-time in 1919. Later, he worked for the Hartford Post for a short time before it closed down. Then he became a sports reporter for the New York Evening Mail. When that newspaper closed in 1923, Sullivan took different jobs with other newspapers like the Associated Press, the Philadelphia Bulletin, the Morning World, the Morning Telegraph, the New York Bulletin, and the Leader. In 1927, he started working for the New York Evening Graphic as a sports writer and then became the sports editor. In 1929, he became the Broadway columnist for the Graphic after Walter Winchell left for the Daily Mirror. Later, he moved to the New York Daily News, where he wrote a column called Little Old New York, which talked about Broadway shows and gossip. He also talked about show business news on the radio. In 1933, Sullivan made a movie called Mr. Broadway, where he was both the writer and the star. In the movie, he showed people around New York City's nightclubs and introduced them to famous entertainers and celebrities. Sullivan became a big name in the entertainment world and was seen as a competitor to Winchell. He often spent time at the El Morocco nightclub, which was across from Winchell's Stork Club. Even as he became more famous, Sullivan kept writing for the New York Daily News. His popularity lasted longer than Winchell's. In the late 1960s, Sullivan spoke well of Winchell in a magazine interview, which helped them become friends again. During his career, Sullivan tried different things in entertainment. In the 1920s and 1930s, he put on vaudeville shows and was often the host. He also ran a radio show on WABC and organized shows to raise money for different causes. In 1948, Marlo Lewis convinced CBS to hire Ed Sullivan to host a variety show every Sunday night called Toast of the Town. Later, they changed the name to The Ed Sullivan Show. It started in June 1948 and was first filmed at Maxine Elliott's Theater on West 39th Street in New York. In January 1953, they moved it to CBS TV Studio 50 at 1697 Broadway. Because the show was so successful and Ed Sullivan was so popular, they renamed the studio the Ed Sullivan Theater in 1967. Later, it was home to The Late Show with David Letterman and The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. At first, the show wasn't a hit. Ed Sullivan had a hard time impressing TV critics who didn't like the show or him. Harriet Van Horn said Sullivan had no personality and only succeeded because of that. Sullivan wrote back to her directly. Critics thought Sullivan wasn't a good actor and seemed stiff and boring. But even though he wasn't a great actor, people liked him because of his awkwardness on camera. In 1955, Time magazine called him stiff and awkward, but said he still charmed audiences. Sullivan was seen as an ordinary guy who brought talented acts to people's TVs. Comedian Fred Allen said Sullivan would be successful as long as there were talented people. Alan King said Sullivan didn't do much, but he did it better than anyone else on TV. These comments showed that The Ed Sullivan Show had a mix of acts, like vaudeville performers, comedians, singers, theater people, puppets like Topo Gigio, and famous athletes. Ed just introduced them to the audience. The show often featured performers from Europe and America. Sullivan had a good sense of humor about himself and liked it when people imitated him on the show. John Byner, Frank Gorshin, Rich Little, and Will Jordan were some of the impersonators who mimicked him. Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers also did impressions of him. These imitations showed Sullivan's stiff posture, raised shoulders, and the way he talked. Will Jordan played Sullivan in several movies like I Want to Hold Your Hand, The Buddy Holly Story, The Doors, Mr. Saturday Night, and Down with Love. He also played Sullivan in the TV movie Elvis in 1979. Sullivan made fun of himself in Jerry Lewis's movie The Patsy in 1964. He also inspired a song in the musical Bye Bye Birdie and appeared as himself in the movie version in 1963. In 1954, he co-hosted a TV special called General Foods' 25th Anniversary Show, a salute to Rogers and Hammerstein. The Ed Sullivan Show is a show that people who lived during World War II and the baby boomer era remember fondly. It was a place where many famous musicians from the 1950s and 1960s first became known to a lot of people. Some of these musicians included Elvis Presley, the Beatles, the Supremes, and others. One special thing about the show was that the Canadian comedy duo Wayne and Schuster appeared on it 67 times, which was a record for any performer. A big moment in the show's history happened when Bill Haley and his Comets played their song Rock Around the Clock in August 1955. It was the first time a rock and roll song was on national TV. Another talented person who appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show was Itzhak Perlman. He was only 13 when he first performed on the show in 1958. His performance not only made classical music popular with more people, but also made Perlman famous, and he stayed famous for many years. Elvis Presley's times on the show are really famous. At first, host Ed Sullivan didn't want him on the show, but Presley finally appeared on September 9, 1956. This was a big deal because Sullivan had said he'd never let Presley on the show. But because of pressure from another TV host, Steve Allen, Sullivan changed his mind and let Presley perform. At the time, Presley was in Los Angeles filming Love Me Tender, so Sullivan's producer went there to make sure everything went well. Since Sullivan was recovering from a bad car accident, Charles Lawton filled in as the host that night. Presley's performances were amazing. During his first time on the show, he sang Don't Be Cruel and Love Me Tender, showing a different, calmer side compared to his other performances on different shows. Despite what many people think, there wasn't any censorship of Presley's performance, and they showed everything he did. His appearances had a big impact. Lots of people watched the first show, with a record-breaking 60.7 million viewers. It was one of the most watched TV events at the time. Presley came back for 2 more shows on October 28, 1956, and January 6, 1957, and each time, millions of people watched. Even though Sullivan praised Presley in public, people backstage say he felt differently. Presley said in a 1969 interview that Sullivan had different, not-so-nice opinions behind the scenes. But Presley's performances made him a big part of the Ed Sullivan Show's history. After Presley was on the show, Sullivan tried to get him back, but they couldn't agree on some things. Still, Presley's time on The Ed Sullivan Show shows how much he influenced popular culture and left a lasting mark. Ed Sullivan wanted to reach lots of people, so he sometimes argued with stars like Frank Sinatra about who would be on his show. He tried to bring different cultures together by having Soviet dancers and acts that younger people liked. In the 1960s, his show had musicians who were part of the counterculture, like Sly and the Family Stone, Janis Joplin, the Rolling Stones, and the Doors. When the Doors performed their song Light My Fire, the lead singer, Jim Morrison, didn't listen when the show asked him to change the lyrics. Sullivan also supported black artists. He didn't give in to sponsors who were racist and helped make American media more diverse. His show had The Temptations, Stevie Wonder, the Jackson 5, Marvin Gaye, and the Supremes, who were one of his favorite acts. Pearl Bailey was on his show almost 20 times. Other guests who came regularly were opera singer Robert Merrill and comedian Myron Cohen. Even though he seemed a bit awkward, Sullivan became a big name in the media and didn't mind making fun of himself. He even acted in movies like Bye Bye Birdie and The Singing Nun. Sullivan's work in TV and music made him important in entertainment and helped break down racial barriers on TV. People who knew him say that growing up in a diverse place like New York City made him open-minded about race and religion. When he wrote for newspapers, Sullivan talked about issues that affected black people. He often supported black causes. For example, if a black team couldn't play in a town, he would try to help. Sullivan wrote about Broadway too. He liked going to nightclubs and watching different acts, especially vaudeville. In 1942, he put on the Harlem Cavalcade, a show with only black performers. Even though the show wasn't doing well, he used his own money to keep it going. Sullivan became friends with black performers who later went on The Ed Sullivan Show. In the beginning, both black and white vaudeville stars performed on the show for little pay to help Sullivan out. Even when the show got popular in the 1960s, Sullivan still had these stars on, knowing that it could make a big difference for them financially. This loyalty was a big part of who he was. A TV special explained that Sullivan's honest way of being led to his success. His show was watched by 75 million Americans every Sunday night. The first episode was on June 20th, 1948, and the first black guests, Billy Kenny and the Ink Spots, were on June 27, 1948. He also had stars like Diana Ross, Harry Belafonte, James Brown, and Diahann Carroll on, which quietly helped break down racial barriers. In another interview, Harry Belafonte said he thought the show was important for the civil rights movement. It helped change how people in America saw black people. When TV showed images of bad things happening to black people in the South, viewers had already seen strong, talented, and respected black individuals on Sullivan's show. This made it harder for people to treat black people badly. Even though Sullivan got angry letters and threats from viewers and sponsors, it didn't bother him. He hugged Pearl Bailey, shook hands with Nat King Cole, and showed kindness to Sarah Vaughan, even though some people didn't like it. One advertiser in Alabama even told people to stop watching the show, and Ford Motors said they might not sponsor it anymore. But Sullivan didn't change how he treated black performers. He always treated them with respect, and he wanted America to do the same. This was his way of trying to make things better in society. In his own life, Sullivan was once going to marry Sybil Bauer, who was a famous swimmer. Sadly, she died from cancer when she was only 23 years old in 1927. In 1926, Sullivan met Sylvia Weinstein, and they started dating. At first, Sylvia didn't tell her family about Sullivan. She said she was dating a Jewish man named Ed Sullivan, but her brother found out the truth. It was Sullivan, who came from a Catholic family. Their families didn't like that they had different religions, so they stopped seeing each other for 3 years. But they didn't listen to their families and got married on April 28, 1930, in a small ceremony at City Hall. After they got married, Sylvia had their daughter, Elizabeth, who was named after Sullivan's mom, who had died that same year. Elizabeth later married Bob Precht, who was the producer of The Ed Sullivan Show. In 1944, the Sullivans moved to the Hotel Delmonico after living at the Hotel Astor on Times Square for a long time. Sullivan rented a room next to theirs and used it as his office until The Ed Sullivan Show ended in 1971. After each show, Sullivan always asked his wife for her thoughts, calling her right away. They often went out to famous places in New York City, like the Stork Club, Danny's Hideaway, and Jimmy Kelly's. Sullivan knew a lot of people, from famous stars to presidents, and he even got to meet popes. Sylvia helped Sullivan manage his money. Sadly, she died on March 16, 1973, because of problems with her aorta. There were sometimes controversies on The Ed Sullivan Show. The Doors got banned after a performance that didn't follow the show's rules. Even though the Doors weren't the usual kind of band for a family show, they were asked to play their song, Light My Fire. But there was a problem with the song's lyrics, especially the part, Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher, which talked about drugs. A producer asked the band to change the line to Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Better. At first, the singer Jim Morrison agreed, But during the performance, he sang the original lyrics, not the changed ones. The show's producers didn't like this and stopped the show right away. They also canceled the band's other planned performances. Bo Diddley's time on the show in 1955 caused some trouble. He was supposed to sing one song, but Sullivan asked him to sing a different one. At first, Diddley said yes, but then he sang his own song instead, which made Sullivan mad. After that, they didn't get along, and Diddley never came back on the show. Buddy Holly and the Crickets had a tough time on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1958. They were supposed to sing 2 songs, but Sullivan wanted them to change one of them. Holly said no, which made Sullivan upset. During their performance, Sullivan tried to mess them up by saying Holly's name wrong and turning off the guitar's microphone. Even though Sullivan tried to ruin it, the audience still liked the performance. Because of that, Sullivan asked them to come back for another show, but Holly said no. Comedian Jackie Mason got banned from The Ed Sullivan Show after a mix-up during his performance in 1964. When President Lyndon B. Johnson came on TV, Sullivan told Mason he had 2 minutes left, but Mason didn't understand and made a gesture, which Sullivan thought was rude. Because of that, Mason couldn't be on the show for 2 years until he said sorry on TV. Bob Dylan decided not to go on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1961. He was going to sing a song that criticized the John Birch Society, but a CBS boss wanted him to sing a different song. Dylan said no, and didn't go on the show at all because he wanted to stick to what he believed in. Like many American entertainers at the time, Sullivan got caught up in the anti-communism feelings of the late 1940s and 1950s. In January 1950, there was a problem when tap dancer Paul Draper was going to be on Toast of the Town. Hester McCullough, who didn't like communists, said Draper was sympathetic to the Communist Party. She asked Sullivan's main sponsor, the Ford Motor Company, to cancel Draper's appearance. Draper said he wasn't a communist and still went on the show. Ford got lots of angry letters, so Sullivan said he wouldn't have controversial guests anymore. After that, Draper had to move to Europe to make money. Sullivan started working closely with Theodore Kirkpatrick from the Counterattack newsletter, which was against communism. If Sullivan wanted to know about a guest's politics, he'd ask Kirkpatrick. In his June 21, 1950 Daily News column, Sullivan wrote that Kirkpatrick has sat in my living room on several occasions and listened attentively to performers eager to secure a certification of loyalty. During the Cold War, there was another problem when Bob Dylan was supposed to be on the show in May 1963. He wanted to sing Talking John Birch Paranoid Blues, which made fun of the ultra-conservative John Birch Society. Everything was okay during rehearsals, but on the day of the show, CBS's Standards and Practices Department said no. They were worried they might get sued for saying the society was like Adolf Hitler. They asked Dylan to sing a different song, but he said he'd rather not perform at all. After that, a lot of people talked about what happened, and Sullivan didn't agree with the network's decision. Sullivan also had a problem with Standards and Practices in 1956. Ingrid Bergman hadn't been in Hollywood since 1950 because of a scandalous love affair. She was planning to come back for a movie called Anastasia. Sullivan thought people would be happy to see her again, so he invited her on the show and went to Europe to film an interview with her, Yul Brynner, and Helen Hayes. But when he got back, Standards and Practices said she couldn't be on the show live or in the interview. Later, Bergman won an Academy Award for her role in Anastasia, and people forgave her. Even though he faced difficulties and sometimes had acts that weren't great, Sullivan became a star in Hollywood. His special charm came from being shy and clumsy, which made him more likable than other TV hosts in the 1960s. Even with these quirks, Sullivan's career took off, and he got a star on the famous Hollywood Walk of Fame. He also won many important Hollywood awards, which showed how much people liked him. Even though he died more than 5 decades ago, Sullivan still has a big influence on Hollywood. Lots of current entertainment shows film in the same place where The Ed Sullivan Show was filmed, and the theater where his show happened is now called the Ed Sullivan Theater in his honor. This shows how much he changed the industry. Famous people like David Letterman and Stephen Colbert have performed at the Ed Sullivan Theater, keeping alive the entertainment legacy that Sullivan started. Even though Sullivan sometimes had arguments with guests, people who knew him well remembered him with affection. His co-workers said he was kind-hearted, and they thought maybe he acted tough on TV because he was insecure, not because he was mean. Before each show, Sullivan felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. showing how much he cared about making each episode special. Even with those feelings, he stuck with his job for an amazing 22 years, which made him one of the biggest TV stars of his time. After he retired, people still talked about Sullivan and the stories from his famous show. One big moment was when he decided to have Elvis Presley on the show, even though he wasn't sure about it at first. That changed the history of rock and roll. Sullivan's show helped lots of new artists get started, which is why he's so important in entertainment history. The Ed Sullivan Show was one of the longest and most watched TV shows in the United States, going on for 4 decades. But as the 1970s started, fewer people watched the show, and it eventually got canceled, even though it was loved by many. Even though he retired, Sullivan didn't stay out of the spotlight for long. In 1974, he came back to TV for a short time before he died, leaving behind a legacy that still inspires entertainers today. In the fall of 1965, CBS started showing its shows in color every week. One of these shows was the famous Sullivan Show. It was live in the Central and Eastern time zones but recorded for later in the Pacific and Mountain time zones. Parts of the show are now on home videos and the official Ed Sullivan Show YouTube channel, so people can keep enjoying it in the future. As time went on, fewer people watched The Sullivan Show. By 1971, the ratings were so low that CBS decided to cancel it, along with a few other long-running shows. This time was later called The Rural Purge. Ed Sullivan, the host of the show, felt really sad about this decision. He didn't want to keep hosting the show for the last 3 months it was supposed to be on. Instead, they showed reruns, and the final episode in June didn't have him in it. Even though the show ended, Sullivan still worked with CBS, doing different jobs there. In June 1973, he came back to host a special for the show's 25th anniversary, showing how much his career meant to people. But in early September 1974, Sullivan got some really bad news. He had advanced esophageal cancer. His health was getting worse, and the doctors didn't think he would get better. His family didn't tell him everything about his illness because they didn't want him to feel too bad. Without him knowing, Sullivan's lifelong habit of smoking probably made his condition worse. He thought his sickness was just another problem from his ongoing battle with stomach ulcers and didn't know how serious it was. On October 13, 1974, Sullivan died at New York's Lenox Hill Hospital. His funeral was at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York and had 2,000 people, even though it was cold and rainy. Some surprising people came too, people who had once been his rivals. Their presence showed how much respect and admiration Sullivan got during his career. As a final tribute, he was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, which marked the end of an era in TV history. After he died, his family told everyone how bad his cancer really was. Even though he was sick, Sullivan never stopped caring about his work until the end. People still remember him as a beloved TV star, not just for what he did in entertainment, but also for how he affected the people who knew him. We hope you liked this video. Subscribe to our channel for more interesting videos. Bye.